You're not afraid of death. You're afraid of facing the life you haven't lived, afraid of spending years pleasing everyone and forgetting yourself, afraid of looking back and realizing you followed every rule except your soul's, afraid you had the time and still let it slip away. The scariest part isn't dying, it's realizing you've been dying on the inside and no one noticed. You keep smiling in photos, punching the clock saying, "I'm fine," but deep down your soul has been silently screaming for a long time. Carl Jung said symbolic death happens long before the body shuts down. It begins when the ego takes over and the self is exiled. When your persona becomes your only identity, when the fear of change is greater than the pain of staying the same. But what if everything you call a crisis, burnout, or numbness is just your soul asking to come back? What if death isn't the end, but the beginning? A portal? A calling? This video is a deep dive into what most people are too afraid to face. What comes after what you thought was the end? You're not really afraid of dying. What terrifies you is facing the life you never truly lived. It's the fear that you spent years trying to please everyone else and forgot yourself in the process. That you looked back and realized you followed all the rules, except the ones that mattered to your soul, that even though you had time, you still managed to waste it. The most frightening thing isn't death itself. It's recognizing that something inside you has been quietly dying for a while, and no one seems to notice. You're still smiling in pictures, showing up to work, saying, "I'm fine." But deep down, your soul has been screaming in silence. Carl Jung believed symbolic death comes long before physical death. It begins the moment the ego takes control and exiles the self. When the mask you wear, the persona, becomes your only face. When your fear of changing becomes stronger than your pain of staying the same. And what if everything you've been calling burnout, depression, crisis, or fatigue is just your soul trying to come back? What if dying isn't the end, but the beginning? A threshold, a sacred invitation. This video is not about endings. It's a journey into that hidden, uncomfortable space that most people spend their lives avoiding, the space that comes after what you thought was over. There's a quiet moment, often ignored, when life stops applauding you. Outwardly, everything seems fine, but inside, something has started to crack. That's when the ego, this protective armor built to keep pain away, begins to fracture. Carl Jung taught that individuation isn't about becoming someone better. It's about becoming who you really are. And for that, certain parts of you must die. The persona you've worn to be accepted, the strong one, the productive one, the agreeable one, might have once saved you. But now it's your prison. There can be no true awakening without mourning these masks. The death of the ego hurts, but that's exactly when the soul whispers, "Now, I can be born." Some people only realize this process when life knocks them down, through a burnout, a breakup, a sudden layoff. It's as if everything that gave them identity suddenly vanishes. And here's the strange thing. Carl Jung didn't see this as a breakdown. He saw it as a crossing. The soul uses chaos to interrupt the autopilot. It's like it's saying, "If you won't stop, I'll stop you." This is the point where many people start looking for therapy, retreats, or spiritual books. Not because they've become enlightened, but because they're falling apart. And that's okay. Sometimes it takes the outer lights going out for us to finally see what's still burning within. So what do you do when everything you once were starts to collapse? First, don't try to glue the pieces back together. The ego will try to rebuild the old character, the same one that led you to exhaustion in the first place. Resist the urge to look strong. This is the time to dive inward. Write, meditate. Seek out practices that quiet the outer noise. Read Jung's Red Book, try conscious breathing, or begin shadow work. But above all, allow yourself to feel. The ego fears deep emotions because they reveal the truth, but the soul needs that connection in order to be born. And here, being born isn't about coming into the world, it's about coming back to yourself. The truth is, ego death isn't a single event, it's a process. A series of small awakenings, broken ties, and quiet inner shifts. Sometimes it arrives in strange dreams, sometimes in an unexpected conversation, and just when you think you've figured it out, another layer appears. The collective unconscious begins to send you symbols, archetypes, and sensations that you can't explain. But if you're even slightly present, you'll realize none of it is random. It's as if your soul has been waiting your whole life for this moment. And the moment you open even a little, it begins to guide you. Quietly, but unmistakably. And maybe, just maybe, this journey of death is actually the beginning of something much greater, something most people spend their lives too afraid to see. Sometimes people keep breathing, keep smiling, even posting selfies. But deep down, they've stopped feeling alive. And this isn't about a sick body. It's about a soul that's fallen asleep. The ego is driving, the persona is steering, and the self, silenced. Jung said many people suffer because they live lives that aren't truly theirs. They work jobs they don't want, stay in relationships out of fear of loneliness, maintain identities they no longer recognize. Every time they ignore an inner calling, they die a little, and the tragedy they don't even notice because society calls this being a responsible adult. But what kind of responsibility is worth your soul? This symbolic death doesn't happen all at once. It creeps in slowly. It begins the moment you stop doing what you love because it doesn't pay. When you bite your tongue to avoid conflict. When you say, "I'm fine," while your soul is quietly sobbing. Bit by bit, you drift away from who you are. And before you know it, you're living on autopilot, waking up, working, sleeping, like a programmed character just performing tasks. At that point, it's not about success or failure anymore. It's about not feeling anything. No pain, no joy, just a socially accepted numbness. This is where shadow work comes in, not as a trend, but as a real courageous act. It asks, who did I bury inside me to survive? Because that lifeless feeling you carry might be the grief of a self abandoned. And while terrifying, it also carries a hidden invitation. If part of you has died, maybe another part is ready to be born. But for something new to be born, you have to bury what no longer serves. That means breaking old patterns, rethinking your relationships, and rescuing lost parts of yourself. It's not a fast process, but it is liberating. A good place to start. Revisit the moments when you felt truly alive. Where were you? Who were you with? What were you doing? Those clues reveal what still pulses inside you. Read authors who awaken your unconscious, Clarissa Pinkola Estes, James Hillman, or Jung himself. They won't give you easy answers, but they'll remind you of the right questions. The person you used to be had to die, and maybe that hurt more than any real-world loss. But here's the good news, that symbolic death creates space for something new, something more authentic, more aligned. Carl Jung believed every collapse is a chance for rebirth, if you're willing to walk through the soul's winter. And here's the surprising part. Sometimes the grief you're feeling isn't even for someone who's gone. It's for a version of you that you abandoned. And maybe it's time to finally listen to that silent cry. Because somewhere inside you, life is still trying to bloom. When someone we love dies, they don't just take their body with them. Sometimes they take a piece of us too. And it's in that absence that grief takes root. But what almost no one tells you is this: grief isn't only about pain, it also opens a crack, a sacred space, a breaking point between who you were and who you could become. Jung saw grief as a form of forced individuation. The soul is pushed inward, the ego collapses, and the self steps closer. Because when life takes something or someone, it's often giving you back to yourself. Harshly, yes, but also with deep potential for transformation. Grief doesn't only follow physical death. There's grief for lost love, for a dream that never came true, for an old version of you that's never coming back. Each of these losses is a chance to reconfigure your inner world, but it requires presence and the courage not to run from the pain. The ego, desperate to stay in control, will try to numb you with social media, overwork, cliché phrases like "life goes on." But what truly heals is feeling, letting the emptiness echo. And in that echo, hearing your soul finally speak what it's been trying to say all along. There are practices that can help you move through grief more consciously. Intuitive writing, for example, is a way to give voice to what has no name. Ask yourself simple questions like, what part of me was lost with this pain? Or who am I now that this is gone? Meditation can bring clarity amid emotional fog. Rituals can help too, writing a goodbye letter, planting something in someone's honor, creating a symbolic altar. These small gestures won't bring back what you've lost, but they reconnect you with what remains. And often, that's when the self emerges, not in what's missing, but in what still breathes. Grief is solitary, yes, but it can also be a kind of spiritual initiation, a sacred passage through which we are reborn. In the silence of loss, the collective unconscious begins to awaken through dreams, symbols, forgotten memories. And if you pay close attention, you'll realize you're not going crazy, you're reconnecting. Pain becomes a language, absence becomes a map, and what once looked like the end might actually be the beginning. Because sometimes losing something is the only way to remember who you truly are. And somewhere in that quiet, invisible, yet deeply real grief, the soul starts to come back together. Carl Jung was never afraid of death. In fact, he studied it with the same depth and passion with which he studied dreams, symbols, and the unconscious mind. During one of his most profound experiences, a near-death state brought on by illness, Jung described mystical visions of distant lands, archetypal images, and an overwhelming sense of belonging to the cosmos. In that moment, he understood something essential. Consciousness does not end where the body stops. He didn't offer dogmatic conclusions, but he left us with clues. Perhaps life continues, just not in the way the ego imagines. The afterlife for Jung wasn't a material extension. It was a continuation of the psyche. This perspective changes everything. If death isn't the end, then the life we live here carries even more symbolic weight. Every choice, every relationship, every ignored shadow echoes beyond the physical realm. We're not talking about religion here, but about a deeper, archetypal, spiritual way of seeing life. The self, that deep inner presence that connects us to something larger, keeps moving forward even after the body is gone. That's why symbols appear in every culture, from Egyptian gods to shamanic visions, from the dreams of those who've had near-death experiences. They all speak the same language. Death is not a wall, it's a transition. And perhaps the most curious part? These truths are all around us, all the time. But the ego, obsessed with control and terrified of loss, refuses to see them. Take ancestral dreams, for example. Jung observed that many of his patients reported vivid encounters with deceased relatives, bringing messages, healing, or warnings. Were these just mental projections? Maybe. But maybe they were echoes of the collective unconscious, manifesting as portals. Have you ever had a dream so real it felt more truthful than your waking life? Have you ever sensed that someone or something you lost still guides you? If so, maybe you've already glimpsed what Jung was trying to show us. The beauty of Jung's approach is that it doesn't ask you to believe blindly. It invites you to observe, to explore your own symbols, to open yourself to mystery without falling into dogma. Because maybe understanding what comes after life isn't about knowing. It's about feeling. Feeling that we are more than flesh and thoughts. That spirituality isn't a belief system, but an inner call. And that everything that dies comes back in another form, on another level, in another language. And if the soul really does continue the journey, as Jung believed, then maybe it's time to start listening to the signs, before life has to silence us just so we can finally hear. Have you ever felt disconnected from yourself, like you were living in your body, but not really inhabiting your experience? This sensation is more common than we think. And while medicine might call it dissociation, spirituality, especially through Jung's lens, sees it as a rupture between the self and the ego. The soul begins to retreat when the ego becomes too dominant, when the persona swallows the essence. It happens quietly, in hollow routines, in relationships devoid of truth, in choices that betray your heart just to satisfy others. The soul cannot bear being ignored for too long. When it feels suffocated, it leaves. It waits in the shadows, hoping to be invited back into life. But you don't notice the disconnect right away. It's subtle, gradual. First, you lose the spark in your eyes. Then, your will to create fades. Soon after, the symptoms arrive. Insomnia, numbness, a lack of meaning. You go to the doctor, take an anti-anxiety pill, get a full checkup. Everything looks normal. But inside, everything's screaming. It's your soul asking to be rescued. This is where shadow work becomes essential, the bold act of looking straight into what's been repressed, forgotten, fragmented, because the soul drifts away when the unconscious becomes too heavy with unresolved material. Jung once said, "What you do not bring into consciousness comes back as fate." And maybe what's making you feel exhausted isn't physical, it's spiritual. It's the weight of not living your truth. Bringing the soul back into the body is an act of radical presence, and it requires daily rituals of reconnection. It doesn't have to be mystical. Sometimes it's just walking barefoot on the grass, cooking while listening to your favorite music, meditating for 5 minutes before bed, calling someone and saying what you really feel, painting again, dancing, writing. These small practices bring meaning back into your everyday life. Here's one simple exercise. At the end of each day, write down one question. When did I feel most alive today? And see what surfaces. That's soul listening. That's embodied spirituality. The soul flees when life becomes a loop, when there's no more room for mystery, for mistakes, for sacred pauses. Jung believed that human beings become sick when they lose contact with the symbolic. That's why so many people, even with a stable life and everything in order, still feel hollow. Because biological life isn't enough. You need to inhabit your body with intention. And for that, the ego must step aside. The persona must soften. Only then can the self find a way in. And in the end, maybe that's the true spiritual calling, not to leave the body in search of light, but to bring the light back into it. The soul doesn't die, it transforms, it changes shape, it hides, it adapts. And the fascinating part, sometimes it comes back with a new face, a new name, a new mission. Carl Jung understood this as part of the psyche's natural flow. Nothing in the soul is destroyed, only recycled. When something within us dies, a phase, an identity, an illusion, it's not the end. It's the beginning of a new way of being. Just like a snake sheds its skin, the soul must release what it has outgrown. And that requires radical surrender, not to suffering, but to transformation. Because spirituality isn't about preserving what's familiar. It's about dying and being reborn 1,000 times while keeping your inner center, the self, intact. That idea can be scary because the ego craves certainty, stability, permanence. But the soul follows a different logic, the logic of symbols, of archetypes, of the collective unconscious. In that language, nothing truly dies. It becomes myth, memory, image. Lost love becomes poetry. Pain becomes art. Existential crisis becomes awakening. Jung observed that every deep transformation passes through a dark night of the soul, a period of confusion, emptiness, disorientation. But it's in that liminal space that the soul forges new shapes. Like coal turning into diamond, it looks like destruction, but it's actually purification. You might not fully understand what's happening now, but your soul does. Want a practical example? Think of someone who's been betrayed, lost everything, and felt completely shattered. That pain, if embraced with awareness, can become a whole new vision of life. It can turn into a book, a mission, a spiritual calling. Clarissa Pinkola Estes, author of Women Who Run with the Wolves, says that scars are maps of the soul. They're not ugly, they're sacred. If you're going through a moment of rupture, don't try to go back to normal. There is no normal anymore. There is only the new. There is only what you're becoming. Practices like art therapy, symbolic rituals, or even mythological studies help shape what's still formless. The soul doesn't care about keeping you comfortable. It cares about making you whole. And sometimes that means letting go of a part of you that has already fulfilled its purpose. It's not easy, but it's not the end. It's inner alchemy at work. Jung would call this individuation the sacred process of becoming who you were always meant to be. Every transformation, no matter how painful, is a crucial step on that path. Because in the end, it's not about saving your soul. It's about letting your soul reveal who you truly are. Underneath all the ego's masks, there are people walking around alive who have already started to leave. And the saddest part? No one notices. They're still working, smiling, fulfilling obligations, but inside, they've already begun to drift toward another place. Not a physical place, but a symbolic one. The soul starts to withdraw when there's no more room for truth. Jung described this as a deep disconnect between the ego and the self. The soul gets sick when the persona becomes the only voice, when life becomes just functioning. What we often call exhaustion may actually be a silent crossing into inner dissolution. This is more common than you think, and it doesn't just happen to the old, the sick, or the depressed. Sometimes it happens to those who have it all. What's missing isn't success, it's meaning, it's purpose, it's a real bond with life. The soul begins to leave when nothing moves you anymore, when every day feels the same, when even your dreams repeat themselves. And no, it's not laziness, it's not weakness, it's a sign that something much deeper is asking for attention. If ignored, this state becomes emotional illness, but if honored, it becomes a portal to reconnection. You've probably seen people recover from serious illness after making radical life changes. They don't just heal their bodies, they heal their souls, because they realize they were merely surviving, not truly living. And then they do the unthinkable. They quit their careers, move to a different country, reconnect with their spirituality. It's not magic, it's spiritual biology. The body responds when the soul comes home. If you feel like you're slowly slipping away, try slowing down. Get quiet. Ask yourself the real questions. Write about what would bring you to tears out of sheer gratitude. Remember what used to make you lose track of time. Listen to the songs that once moved you. Revisit the symbols that once guided you, even if you've forgotten them. The soul only begins to leave when it's no longer invited to inhabit life fully, but it can return. And more than just return, it must. Jung said illness is the psyche's attempt to heal itself. That deep fatigue you feel, it might be your soul whispering, "Please, see me." And maybe you don't need to change everything, just shift from the inside. Maybe re-enchantment starts with something small, a scent, a memory, a moment of silence. Because when the soul begins to return, it comes back whole. And then everything changes, even the body, even reality. But for that to happen, something still needs to be understood. You're not afraid of death. You're afraid of realizing you never truly lived. So many people spend their entire lives running from death, but what really haunts them is the thought that they might have never truly lived. Jung believed that the fear of death often hides a deeper truth, the fear of never having followed your soul, the fear of being nothing more than a collection of obligations, roles, and other people's expectations. The panic isn't about leaving this world, it's about realizing that even while alive, you never gave yourself permission to exist fully. And that realization hits like a punch to the gut because time passed and you were too busy being who they wanted to remember who you are. This fear shows up in the silence, when the noise dies down, when you're alone with yourself. That ache you feel, that strange urgency. The mind calls it a crisis, but the soul knows. It's a calling. It's that inner voice saying, this isn't your life. And then the question arises, what would you do if you had only 1 year left, or 1 month? It's startling how many people wouldn't know, because they were never taught to listen to their desires, only to chase goals, please others, survive, but never to live. And that in itself is a kind of early death. So the real question isn't when you'll die, it's when you'll start to live. And that takes courage, the courage to break away from what's expected, to disappoint a few people, to step outside the comfort zone. Your soul doesn't crave a perfect life. It longs for a life of presence, a life of truth, a life where your choices don't make your stomach turn with regret. And it doesn't have to start big. Just say a firm no or a heartfelt yes. Take one step off the usual path. Have one conversation that lights you up. Read one book that opens your eyes. Sit in one silence that listens back. All of that is embodied spirituality. All of that is shadow work. All of that is real living. And the most beautiful part? It's never too late. The self doesn't age, it simply waits for you to grow tired of lies, masks, and excuses, waits for the ego to surrender, waits for the persona to fall away. And when it finally does, the self begins to guide, quietly, surely, like an invisible compass, pointing you toward what truly matters. Because in the end, living isn't about avoiding death. It's about arriving at it and being able to say, I lived everything that was mine to live. So now that you've made it this far, tell me honestly, how many parts of you have died in silence without even a goodbye? How many times have you betrayed your own soul just to keep up appearances? Maybe you're not afraid of death. Maybe you're just afraid of reaching the end and realizing you never really lived. But here's the good news, it's not too late. If this message stirred something inside you, if it woke up memories, truths, wounds, or courage, then like this video now. It helps this channel reach other souls who are also on the edge of awakening. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Here, every video is an invitation to dive deep, reconnect, and remember who you truly are. And if you know someone who's feeling lost, tired, or empty, share this with them. Sometimes, one message is all it takes to save a soul from being forgotten. Now tell me, which part of this journey felt the truest to you? What are you no longer willing to silence? Leave a comment below, because your pain might be the mirror someone else needs to heal. Here, we don't talk about death as an ending. We talk about the rebirth that begins the moment you finally decide to live.